So hello and welcome to today's video. So for today's episode of Bully Beta, I'm going to be covering the story to Bully we never got. Now I have touched upon this stuff briefly before, but I've never made a full video explaining the entire storyline before, just usually the small bits like the 7th chapter and the original mission loadout. But Rockstar left behind an awful lot of files that tell us near enough everything they had planned originally, in vivid detail too. Now all of this is still found in the game's files and I will list sources when possible. So let's start off at the very beginning of chapter 5. Now this is probably the only change which makes sense, as initially making a mark was not going to be the first mission of chapter 5 at all. Instead the entire chapter began with everybody hating on Jimmy, and this is proven by the game's files, where making a mark is listed as the last mission of the chapter as opposed to the first. The main plot to chapter 5, where Jimmy basically loses everything, was still the original idea, but was dealt with very differently to the story we got. Now this first change implies the entire chapter introduction sequence of Jimmy becoming popular and ruling Bullworth was not going to happen, but instead the entirety of the scene was going to be Jimmy losing everything somehow, leaving the player with a bit of mystery as to what's going on before the chapter begins. Of course this was probably changed to the introduction we got in the final game because it gives the player a bit of time to relax and enjoy being king of the school for a bit, being on good terms with the jocks for once, and stops them being thrown into the deep end where everybody hates them outright. Now the first mission Jimmy would take part in would be Rats in the Library, then followed up by Preppy's Vandalised, and then Jimmy would rescue Johnny Vincent. Now you might notice I never mentioned the Gym is Burning, and that's because the Gym is Burning was left as the last faction mission where Jimmy would help out, and this is because there's a major chunk of the chapter's storyline missing in that mission. Initially, upon rescuing everybody from the fire, Jimmy would search the gym for the arsonist, as he does in the final game, but upon finding Gurney, instead of Gurney attacking Jimmy and the mission ending there and then, Jimmy would actually give chase to Gurney, chasing him halfway across Bullworth while being chased and taunted by a few jocks who call him a terrorist, and also assaulted by a few townies while he's chasing Gurney. The chase still exists in the final game's script and incredibly weirdly is only blocked because of the gym's doors being shut. Seriously, to enable this cut mission chase, all modders have to do is unlock the gym's door, and then exit after Jimmy tells Mandy to get out, then the chase will begin as normal. Eventually Gurney would hightail it back to Blue Skies Industrial Park and run all the way back to the townies' hideout in the power plant. I assume here Jimmy would meet or at least hear of the townies' leader Edgar Munson, and I'll cover that very shortly. After this Jimmy would then go and look around Blue Skies Industrial Park for clues. This is where he meets Zoe Taylor and revenge on Mr. Byrne would take place. After getting on good terms with Zoe, Jimmy heads back to Borth Academy to find Pete and launch an assault on the townies' hideout. Now some of you may think, but that's just like the final game, isn't it, you know, busting in. It's not, because Jimmy isn't expelled at this point, and the early cutscene for the mission exists and is much shorter than it is in the final game, being much more different to this one.
We gotta teach that Edgar kid a lesson.
We've got the old Jimmy back.
That kid is a lunatic. I bet if we knock some sense into him, he'll turn on Gary.
All right, what's the plan?
It's really complicated.
Great.
Yeah, I march in there and beat the crap out of him.
Well, at least it's subtle.
That's right.
Notice how Jimmy's angrier. The cutscene takes place outside the school building's front. Also notice how Jimmy mentions Edgar by name. This does not actually happen at all, because as you probably remember, in the final game Jimmy doesn't actually know who Edgar is until busting in. There's also no mention of Russell Northrop here too, but he still tags along, so it's likely the Russell idea was still going to happen during the mission instead of the cutscene. Busting in would have still happened as normal. Jimmy fights Edgar, Russell launches a suicide attempt to break the townies' barrier, and so on. But after this there's an entirely cut mission that we know absolutely nothing about, and that's because the entire mission is missing. There's no audio or text that exists for it, but it's very likely that it had something to do with Edgar Munson. At this point Jimmy would then launch his tag on City Hall, but rather than Jimmy being encouraged by Ted, Ernest and Darby, and then go straight to City Hall, he'd explain his plan to Pete, who somehow knows Clint, or Henry, or whatever name he goes by nowadays, and Jimmy would go and pay him a visit for some spray. When Jimmy arrives, Clint's bike would be stolen, and Jimmy would get it back for him in exchange for the paint he needs. But Clint tells Jimmy the paint he needs is in the paint depot, and when Jimmy gets there he's attacked by a few more dropouts, because at this point Jimmy still hasn't been expelled, and for some reason Ernest Jones would be here. And not actually hating Jimmy, but instead helping him, much like Johnny Vincent would in a way. And then somebody would call the police on Jimmy and Ernest because of the fight that broke out with the townies. After escaping the police, Jimmy would then make his way to Town Hall and begin his Bullworthless spray and then take a photo of his handiwork. When Jimmy arrives back at the dorm, Pete would explain that something happened and everybody wants a fight. Now this is very clever, because this cutscene does exist in the final game, and after this is when everybody hates Jimmy and all that. But this was actually a setup to complete mayhem. So it might mean the riots might have been enabled from this point onwards, a bit like GTA San Andreas, where towards the end of the game Officer Tenpenny gets found not guilty in court and the entirety of Los Santos becomes engulfed in riots. Of course, this might have been changed to avoid appearing a bit too similar to GTA San Andreas in terms of the ending. Now for a quick fire round, let's take a look at that completely deleted mission. Now I know some of you might be saying, but didn't you say there's no files for it whatsoever? What's there to look at? Well, let's take a look at the ending to Finding Johnny Vincent. At the end of Finding Johnny Vincent, Johnny mentions he was put in his asylum because of rumours of Lola Lombardi going with townies, and this ties in with another deleted mission. On the Wii version of Bully only, there's a beta version of the mission The Collector, which is listed as the 10th mission of Chapter 5. Now this does appear on Scholarship Edition as a side mission and features Clint and Jimmy stealing bikes. If played on the Wii, it had something to do with Edgar, Lola and a few other townies. Now this mission has no audio, it has no dialogue, and the entire mission setup is the exact same, you just steal bikes for Edgar. But for some strange reason, it's listed as a main mission on the Wii version. Could The Collector have originally been a main mission that would have gave a bit more character depth to Edgar? After tagging City Hall, Chapter 6 would begin, and there's another oddity with the Making a Mark mission which also confirms this. And that is, Making a Mark is one of the very few non-boss battle missions in Bully with a fully animated cutscene at the end. The others being Welcome to Bullworth, which of course, you know, is the introduction mission, Cook's Date, and the Rudy the Red-Nosed Santa missions. Every time a chapter in Bully comes to an end, it always ends with a cutscene, fade to black, next chapter begins. Chapter 6 would begin with Jimmy getting expelled.
Great work, Jimmy boy. Expelled again and beaten by Gary. Man, I've got to sort this out fast.
And because it was just Complete Mayhem and Final Showdown, it was merged with Chapter 5 instead. Now Complete Mayhem went through quite a few changes itself, which I did a video on a few years back, so I'll link that in the description below, but I'll briefly go over everything anyway. First of all, when Jimmy goes to find Russell, he would actually have to outrun the police and meet Pete outside the school, not just run 2 blocks and that's it. The faction leaders, after Jimmy beats them up, would actually team up with Jimmy rather than, well, just disappear outright. The girls of the school would also have appeared, Johnny would have cheated on Lola with Mandy, and Jimmy and the group leaders would all attack Seth guarding the academy. And when entering the academy, Jimmy would have chased Gary through the academy too. And when confronting Gary, Jimmy would have chased Gary through the academy onto the roof too. Now Final Showdown is where things get a bit more interesting. Final Showdown had at least 3 versions planned, all with different endings, one of which had Gary Smith dying apparently. There are loads of scarce files, but thanks to the leftover soundtrack we know there are at least 3 versions planned. After beating Gary, Chapter 7 would begin, and this is also where things get a bit confusing. Starting off, we all know that there are 3 missions planned, but this chapter was dropped early on, some believe in its sneplog, following on from the events of the fight with Gary and wrapping up some loose ends, something that would actually become a bit of a staple in the Red Dead Redemption series, others thinking Final Showdown had an alternate outcome where Gary won or he got away or something like that. I'm more inclined to believe that Chapter 7 was a bit more of an epilogue chapter, because Jimmy's ending monologue when he exits the academy seems very fitting for a usual chapter scene, if that makes any sense. Here's a quick mock-up I did using Endless Summer's chapter.
Finally, everything is sorted out. More or less. I mean, I don't want to say we're going to live happily ever after or anything like that, but life is certainly going to get easier.
Of course, I don't have much else to go over here since we have no game files other than the mission markers, which all took place in Old Boar Vale. Mission 1 would have taken place outside Jimmy's Beach Club safe house, Mission 3 taking place in the cemetery. In fact, if you use the super mod and you force the game to summer, even if you're in Chapter 6, the pause menu will say you're in Chapter 7 instead. Because of this, some believe that Gary Smith did die in Final Showdown, and this might have been some bonus ending involving Jimmy overlooking his grave. This is backed up, as mentioned earlier, by Final Showdown having multiple versions and Bully's much darker theme. There may have been also more missions planned in Chapter 7 or not, but either way that brings us to our end, and that's the story to Bully we never got, or the original story to Bully we never got.